now pass over to Emily, and I hope you enjoy the talk.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'd just like to ask, can everybody hear me? Thank you. Will you let me know? That's a wave, and I can do puppets. No. Before I tell you about this remarkable history, I'd like to take this opportunity to dedicate this talk to a good friend of the museum and a very good friend of the group that I know sitting here in the front row. Her name was Jane McCrum. She came here a lot, and in particular, she liked the Foe to Friend exhibition because she and her husband had lived in Germany in the British Army. And she told me several times how much she thought it captured the truth and the experience of what was a complicated, extraordinary time. So if you haven't seen Foe to Friend, please do so. It's free. And in the meantime, this is for Jane. I wish she was here. So I'm going to primarily talk about the Royal Air Force. And when I was asked to do this talk, our contact at the museum said, you remember, Emily, the key word in the name of the museum is Army. And I really always want to say, but I don't know a great deal about the Army, unless it's doctors. But anyway, this is where, when we look at D-Day, we need to see that the services are very interwoven. And this is a classic example of this. At some point, somebody came to the very sensible conclusion that when planning for the D-Day landings, when the landings were made on the beaches, it would not be helpful to have a lot of casualties sitting on the beaches waiting to be collected by barge and then onto hospital ships. However the D-Day landing went, that was not going to be useful. And so this evacuation of casualties should be done by aircraft. And there were some obvious aircraft to do it with. They were Dakotas. They were going to be supplying. They were going out full and coming back empty. And so what was decided was that a specialist corps of WAFs, of nurses, women who were already nurses, would be trained up in order to accompany these planes, to collect the casualties, and then bring them back across the channel, thereby rendering it a quicker journey for casualties and not clogging up the beaches. And for anyone who's ever seen films or photography or any of the really great films about D-Day, even if the landings went successfully, this was very much an issue, trying to keep a handle on who was landing, who was taking off, and where they were going afterwards. So I'm flagging up this extraordinary group of nurses. They were called air ambulance nurses, but they did some press, because the press has always been with us. They did some press on the first day that they flew, which was D-Day +7. For anybody who doesn't want to do the maths, that's June the 13th. And this was the first Flying Nightingale who went out on the first flight to collect casualties. Her name was Corporal Lydia Alford, and it's a great picture. I think this is the kind of picture that when you get home as the photographer and journalist, you're thinking, thank you. Her perm looks great, her face looks great. She's got just that level of concentration and dedication. And I think if we look a little bit of it, could we get a move on with this? I have patience to collect. So this becomes a point at which the Royal Air Force and the Army have to link up. It's going to be important. It's also going to make it a little bit complicated, but this is essentially an Army story, National Army Museum at the back, okay? It's really about the Army. I know there's planes, but it's really Army. What is of particular interest about Corporal Alford was that when she'd finished her service in France, she then, and this is the anniversary this week, performed her air ambulance duties at Arnhem. And so she was evacuating casualties from Arnhem throughout those dreadful days. We forget that when we look at nurses, we can often see the whole war. This is the whole war. This is what the war really looks like. Someone who saw more casualties than almost anyone else, who went on and then went and collected injured prisoners of war and then evacuated children from concentration camps. Lydia Alford really saw the whole war. And she was, as I've written, the first woman to be sent deliberately into an active war zone. Now, I know there were women in SOE who went to support the resistance. There were women who landed with medical units on the beaches. But Lydia was taken out beyond the beaches to pieces of land that had just been secured. And she was the first one. There were others, but she was the first one. And it helps that she was a determined and photogenic person. So just to go back to remind you about D-Day, D-Day is June the 6th, 1944, and there were 5 beaches, of which 2 were British. Lydia will land and serve the casualties from Sword Beach, the most eastward part of the beaches. I had to have a bit of a guess at where RAF Blake Hill Farm was. It is showing, yes. So Lydia was based at RAF Blake Hill Farm, although the Flying Nightingales as a corps were at many RAF stations, but I've chosen to focus on Blake Hill because I've chosen to focus on Lydia. And you can see the landings, those landings. If anybody hasn't done a D-Day, hasn't gone and looked at the D-Day landing beaches, I really recommend it. You need a week to do it properly, but if you only have a day, go to Omaha, which was the American beach, which saw some really dreadful casualties. And then you can walk from Omaha to Colville-sur-Mer and visit the American cemetery. And that's the experience in a nutshell. Unless, of course, you were a politician from the last government, in which case you come home a bit early. But don't come home a bit early. Stay until it closes. So the D-Day. So this is just to remind us about the D-Day landings, and what's important on this map are the beaches. So Sword, the British beach, and the 2 towns of Bayeux and Caen, which were part of the British strategy to get to. There's a thin blue line. I realise I should have made it thicker. I'm just going to run and point. So it goes from Blake Hill through the flags to Bayeux. That was the very first flight of the Flying Nightingales, which carried Lydia, and it went from Blake Hill to just close to Bayeux. I don't exactly know. It was never straight over the channel. When we think about the beaches being chaotic, flying over the channel was really chaotic. There were planes going forth and planes going back. And if people know the story of Glenn Miller, you'll know that he was shot down because some of the planes were working on Greenwich Mean Time, and some of them were working on an hour's difference. And so you didn't necessarily know who was ahead of you, and that might have been an enemy plane. So just setting out to cross the channel is an immensely brave act. Just to give you some background on Sword Beach, H-hour. I don't get to do army stuff very often, so you'll forgive me for endlessly repeating D-Day +7 and not saying June the 13th. H-hour was 700 hours. And Sword Beach for the British troops was in fact relatively straightforward. This was a plan that did survive contact with the enemy because there wasn't very much contact with the enemy. And I can say that now, but for the men in the landing barges, as you can see, the weather wasn't great, it was choppy, most of them were seasick, and nobody really knew what was ahead of them. In fact, there wasn't very much ahead of them. The Canadians and the British were lucky in that respect. The Americans, much less so. But they are about, this is it. So this was a photograph taken, again, someone about to land on the beaches. I think you can get an indication of how the sea was from that picture. You can see them holding their bayonets and their radio aerials, and they're about to set foot on occupied Europe, the northern coast of occupied Europe, that no one has done for several years. I think we underestimate the courage of the millions of ordinary men who came from places and did that. And then you can see they were able to unload relatively quickly. They could get going, and again, this is a photograph taken from D-Day. They were unpacking, setting up beach defences, and there was really very little to stop them doing this. They were not huddled in foxholes trying to unload their stuff. They could stand up, they could set up barbed wire fences, they could bring their supplies. And so this really was, Sword is very efficient. It makes for a slightly less interesting visit, I have to say. It's a long, well-organised beach when you go there. Still worth it. And by 9:30, they had disembarked 30,000 men onto Sword. They had disembarked 300 guns, and 700 vehicles had been driven out of the barges, through the surf, and onto the beach. And those vehicles were all carrying supplies. So this was really quite a successful landing. I think our image of landings on D-Day tends to come from the American beaches, particularly from Omaha. But Sword wasn't all that difficult. Nevertheless, there were 1,300 casualties who were injured, and this went from a range of casualties who were quite badly injured to people who had relatively minor injuries. There had been provisions for medical care on all the beaches, and on Sword there was the 50th Field Hospital, and you can see an image at the top. This is where it had been running for a couple of weeks, so there's some more women there. But this was a traditional field hospital of the kind that we tend to still use now. Tented, so very flexible, and able to give men care for the first 10 or 12 hours of their injury. That's really what military medical care is about. It's about stabilizing a casualty and making them strong enough so that they can be moved on to what will eventually be a hospital at home. And that's what's going on in the tented field hospital just off Sword Beach. And again, it was something where it met all the objectives. And by midnight, most of those 30,000 men had headed for Bayeux. If I just go back to the map, you can see the Bayeux, and had met up with the Canadians, as was their designated instruction. So they'd met up with the Canadian forces, who'd also landed relatively successfully. It's at that point, the next day, where the plan stops surviving contact with the enemy. They will press on to Caen, and then everything will become very complicated. And that, I don't do that. You need to come to someone else's lecture for that. I don't do Caen and the bocage. It takes a very long time. It's very complicated. But please come. I'm sure they'll get somebody very good. Anyway, on D-Day at Blake Hill Farm, back at Blake Hill Farm, on D-Day itself, there were a squadron from Transport Command of Dakota aircraft. A Douglas Dakota aircraft is designated as the workhorse shuttle of the D-Day plan. And they were indeed a really successful choice of aircraft. So the image of the aircraft that you can see is a Douglas Dakota, and we can tell that it was on D-Day because it's got the stripes on its bottom and on its wing. It's the thing that I'm annoyed about most frequently. My husband knows that if I throw a slipper at the television, it's because somebody's using an aircraft with D-Day markings before June the 6th, 1944. It's not very much to ask. I saw a puzzle once, and I like a puzzle. It was a puzzle of the Bomber Command, and there were aircraft with the stripes on, and I have still to this day struggled not to write to the puzzles manufacturer and ask them to reissue the puzzle with the aircraft correctly marked. But anyway, this aircraft is correctly marked. So 233 Squadron is part of Transport Command, and they are moving people and stuff for D-Day. And included in their remit is the air ambulance service, manned, it's not a great, staffed by our Flying Nightingales. So this is a photograph taken at Blake Hill on D-Day, and you can see the Dakotas all lining up to take off. I do feel really that I suddenly know a lot about the Army when I use things like they're part of B Echelon. And just in case there's anyone in the room who doesn't know what B Echelon was, which was me 2 days ago, B echelon is the echelon that was designated to transport personnel and vehicles that would remain in France for the long term. So in particular, they were transporting tinned food, lots of corned beef. Don't want to get stuck on a Dakota if you don't like corned beef. Lots of corned beef, but also machines from which could be constructed mechanical workshops. So they're setting up the infrastructure for the foothold to be kept in northern France and Belgium. So all those 300 trucks that were coming over, probably a fair few of them were going to need a little bit of tinkering with. The Dakota would have bought the tools and the mechanics and the sheds where those vans or other vehicles could receive treatment, could receive repair. So that's what B echelon is. It's B echelon means that we're there for a long time. You don't fly B echelon unless you're pretty confident that you're going to be able to stay there and you're going to be able to support the men and material that's going forward. B echelon. There are other echelons. I kind of know what they are, but mainly I know what B echelon is. So we have D-Day, we have Blake Hill, we have the Dakotas who are going to fly the Flying Nightingales. And so let's go back to the story of Corporal Alford and her colleagues. So Corporal Alford had been a nurse, as many women, including my own grandmother, as war broke out, went and trained to be nurses immediately. That was what they could offer the war effort. And Corporal Alford had trained to be a nurse. She had joined the WAF, the WAF. It's okay to say WAF, isn't it? Yeah, she had joined the WAF. And she was an experienced nurse nursing the wounded. In fact, she had been part of the air ambulance service before she became a Flying Nightingale. Aircraft were used to move patients around Britain. So if for instance, air crew came in and had to Scotland and needed to be moved to one of the larger hospitals, they did it by air because it was quicker. And so they had women such as Lydia up supervising that movement. But that, of course, was much more straightforward, and they weren't under fire. There wasn't the pressure of going into and coming out of a live battlefield. So she'd done her training, and when the call goes out in March 43 for volunteers for the air ambulance, she is one of the very first to put her hand up. And she'd already done her medical training, so she didn't need much else. She needs air training. She does a little training at the RAF hospital at Rawton, so she has some, it's a little too RAF, I know, she has some expectation of war casualty, but she comes to Blake Hill to do her airworthy training. And her flying training. And I listed this because I thought this was really something that if you didn't have the training for this, these would be things that would be very challenging on your first flight. She does dinghy drill. She has to learn how to inflate a dinghy and in the water get into the dinghy. And as once an RAF veteran told me, and if she's out there for a long time, she'll have to learn how to eat a seagull. It's something that when people talk about getting lost in the channel and waiting to be picked up, you sit there very quiet, and your water runs out, and your biscuits have gone to the bottom of the ocean, really, and you realise you haven't got anything to fish with. Pretty much the only thing that's left to you are seagulls. We don't know. We don't have anything from Lydia's, which she didn't leave diaries, and she never mentioned if there was eating a seagull training. But dinghy drill requires you've got to get the dinghy up, you've got to get the dinghy full inflated, you've got to get into the dinghy and make sure that there's no water in it. You'll also have to put your colleagues and your patients in the dinghy. So just two little quite ordinary words actually mean a great deal. She would have learned how to parachute jump, although Nightingales were encouraged not to parachute from their planes because it meant abandoning their patients. They were asked to remain with the planes as long as they could so they could stay with their patients, and the pilots looked to land on water so that the nurses and the patients could be unloaded, and then the dinghy drill would kick in. They were also, really importantly, assessed for air sickness. If you had persistent air sickness, you couldn't be a Flying Nightingale. And between 10 and 15% of everybody who volunteered for the air ambulance had persistent air sickness. And so there was nothing to be done, but they were going to have to stay on the ground and drive vehicles. Fortunately, Lydia was not airsick. And then the last thing that she was asked to do was flying awareness. And again, sounds very simple, but it's what happened when there's turbulence, what happens when the aircraft twists and turns because they're under fire. And I don't know if you can see the small picture of Lydia. Actually, I'll just go back to the big picture because you see it better there. In the background, there are 3 RAF crewmen. And I rather suspect that they liked flying air awareness flights because you got to chuck a nurse around in the back of your aircraft and say, it's all for training purposes, love. If you don't like it, you should be driving a Land Rover. I don't know. I'm reading that in. I really don't know. But the RAF is quite cynical by this point, and I do know quite a lot about them. So I really think that's not an unreasonable assumption. So you can start to see some of Lydia's colleagues here. We have a full length. This was another colleague of Lydia. Again, a picture taken on D-Day +7, one of the very first people to go. And as you can see that she's carrying supplies. The big packet has oxygen tanks in it. And she's wearing a Red Cross brassard. And I'm going to pay attention to that a little later. So they wait for their briefing, they wait to be told where they're going, and they get onto the Dakota. That is carrying, remember, at this point, for this leg of the journey, not people. It's carrying parts and machines and tins of corned beef. There isn't anywhere for them to sit. They have to make a space for themselves on a big pile of corned beef. I mean, it might be tyres, it might be boxes of tools for the machine, but a big pile of corned beef sounds more dramatic and exciting, and you'll remember it. They get their press briefing and they have their photographs taken. And it's a journalist who says, why, you're Flying Nightingales. And that would be the name that sticks with them forever. And they join 2 other Dakotas flying out from Blake Hill to a newly built airfield in Normandy. And this is an airfield that's near Bayeux. I'm just going to go back to where the map is. So it's near Bayeux. So I have put the line in the right place. And it's one of the indicators that everything is going well for the troops that have landed during Operation Neptune. Operation Overlord is the name of the entire invasion effort, and Operation Neptune is the landing on the beaches. And one of the first things that they will need to do is they will need to build temporary runways. So this is a picture of a temporary runway. It's not I'm afraid it doesn't blow up any bigger than that. But I hope you can see the white line that is the runway. So this was the runway that they were going to, Airfield B2 at Bazanville. And because my dad is here, I looked up what the geology of the region was that would have made the runway white. And the reason is limestone, not chalk, limestone. So when they dug, I was going to ask him actually, and then I thought, no, I'm going to look. And in fact, I included the geological map of the region, which could be anything, but which was circulated to the runway builders. So that's why you can see this. It would have been a relatively straightforward business to make a runway that you could see. There were other runways that were chalk, but otherwise, if it had come up dark, they would have had to paint it. But runway B2 at Bazanville, they didn't have to. So they land in Bazanville, and by then everybody knows that this is where you can take casualties from Sword Beach to, and they will be collected. So this is the Nightingales at work. This comes back to the flying acclimatization, the flying training. It is, I think we go forward in our heads to the nursing, but in fact, it's being in an aircraft that is by far the most challenging aspect of air ambulance work. In the First World War, which is really my war, it's my happy place, it's not my happy, but you know what I mean. In the First World War, one of the things that I came to understand was that there were specialised stretcher bearers and orderlies who would entrain casualties, put them on the hospital trains and detrain them. And they learned to do this in an extraordinarily expert manner. They could get wounded men on and off really quickly, and without in any way aggravating their injuries. And this is what the Flying Nightingales have to do. And it's really hard. This is a Dakota. As you can see, it's a correctly striped Dakota. But you've got to get, if you think about getting into an aircraft where you have to get up to the door, where this is really something it's designed to load supplies, and you have to get a wounded man on a stretcher either on or off carefully without his injuries being aggravated. So that's an extraordinary skill. And we know from the writings of some of the soldiers who came home with the Nightingales that not only were the Nightingales very good at this, but they were very good at what we might call soft skills. So they would say, "It's all right, love, you'll be fine." You know, when you saw that there were burly men chucking your stretchers into the back of the aircraft, when there was a Nightingale there, they felt that the work was done more carefully, and they also felt reassured by the presence of a woman and by the calmness that a woman would give in that position. Again, these are experienced nurses. They would know that a lot of nursing is speaking calmly. And this was all immensely valuable. But again, you can see just the physical logistical challenge of lifting a stretcher. So the Dakotas were originally allocated to carry 14 stretcher cases and 6 walking wounded. As is the case in all wars, within a couple of weeks, those limits don't survive contact with the enemy. In the end, they carried 24 stretchers in a row and as many as 10 walking wounded. They don't fly very high. They fly at 3,000 feet. That's the nature of aircraft then, but it's also important for the kinds of injuries that people are going to be having whilst they're on the aircraft. And then what if I take you back to that RAF Army integration, what this Flying Nightingale is doing is what she probably would have done most of the time on the trip, which is paperwork. There was always a great deal of paperwork. If a soldier had been wounded and had been allocated a place on an army hospital ship, he had form, I can't remember what the number is, but it's got a number and it's a specific form. If it was then decided that he would fly by air because it was quicker and it freed up space on the beach, that form was formally withdrawn, and an RAF form, the F2077 form, was reallocated, and it had to be made very sure that they didn't have the casualty wasn't allocated to be in 2 places at once. And as with all RAF forms, 2074 comes in triplicate. And it has to be passed over very carefully when the patient arrives at their landing destination. So this is one of the Flying Nightingales, keeping an eye on everything around her. On the floor, you can see the stretcher cases, and then you can see she's talking to one of the walking wounded. We can't see where his injury is, but he's well enough to sit on the seat. And she's noting down carefully his name, his rank, his serial number, where he got his injury, and telling him where he'll be going. So he will have a copy of that. She'll keep a copy of that paperwork. He'll have a copy of that paperwork, and the receiving party back at Blake Hill or one of the other RAF stations will have a copy of that paperwork because, you know, things never change. And it hasn't got any better now we have computers, incidentally. People still get lost or are in 2 places at once or are wheeled in for the wrong surgery. Well, what can you do? So Lydia didn't write much down about her flight. She did many flights on that first day, but she says she remembered the dust, which was everywhere. That would be the limestone, I'm guessing. And that she had water and panniers of tea. And I think that's probably panniers of tea would be a very good book for a history of medical care throughout the wars, because as long as you've got a pannier of tea and probably something to light people's cigarettes with, but they weren't allowed to smoke on the Dakotas. But if you've got a pannier of tea, you've got a starting point. If you have kindness and consideration of the injuries that the patients have, if you have a situational awareness not only for yourself, but also for men who were injured and for most of them, this was the first time they'd ever been on an aeroplane. You know, we didn't have cheap flights to Spain then. You went to places on trains or on ships, but you didn't go on an aeroplane. So there's takeoff and there's landing and all the things in between, all the things that the Nightingales have been trained to deal with, including attack by enemy aircraft or long-range artillery. So being considerate to the men that they're with and understanding how they might be feeling in addition to the fact that they had been wounded. On the other hand, you have the advantage that they are going home. They're going back to Blighty, as they used to say in the First World War, and they still said in the Second World War. And when they crossed the coast, the Nightingales always made a point of saying, we've crossed the coast, and there would be general cheering and singing of patriotic songs. So I wanted to show you a little bit about, this is the logs of Nightingales, one of the Nightingales did. So there was always paperwork. When their day had finally finished, they filled out a log of, they added to a log of the work that they'd been done. And I'm not going to go through all of it, but this is a very good, I'm always happy to send this image on if anybody wants it. This is a very good recording of what life was as a Nightingale. I don't know if it was green ink, by the way. Somebody probably knows that, but I don't know if it's green ink. It looks green. It might have gone green. It might have been blue that went green. And it talks about the training flights that they have, and then it moves into the 17th of June, and then you are seeing the deliveries. They're coming from England, and they're going to, she went to strip B5. And then she went to B5 and stayed at B5, and then she went back to Broadwell. And these are really useful documents because they tell us how long the flights are. By and large, the flight back from France to Britain was about an hour and a half. So not too long, but long enough to get really frightened. This is hard work. And then I made a list, and I wanted just to talk about, in addition to the paperwork, to form 2074 in triplicate, and you have to remember a pen, and probably not an ink pen, because ink pens aren't great when things are being tossed around, so you want a good dark pencil, which you might go over with later, and you have to press hard enough to make sure that everything can be read. These are all things that we don't think about now, but we should. And I talked about the nurses and the brassards, the armband that they have with the Red Cross on it. It's very problematic for the planes that are landing at the new airstrips, because they cannot technically be classified as medical flights. They're bringing in supplies and stores and sometimes ammunition. So they have their D-Day stripes, but what they cannot have is a Red Cross flag painted on them. In other parts of the war, when the flights are just medical flights, they can have that painted on them, but not this one. So the Flying Nightingales had their brassards with the Red Cross on to indicate that they were medical staff. And the first thing that they did when they arrived at the temporary landing runways was to run a Red Cross flag up the flagpole. That's what you do when you build a temporary runway. There are a range of things you put in, but you put in a flagpole. It's really a working flagpole and a rope. So they would run a flag up that indicated what squadron they were from, and they would run a Red Cross flag up, which would fly during loading. That was the first thing that they did. It was an indication to those in ambulances and Land Rovers who were bringing them patients that they had arrived, that this runway was now for a Dakota air evacuation flight, and also an indication that the runway should not be targeted. It's mixed. It's a mixed picture as to whether or not the Red Cross flag worked, but it was a good indication and a good symbolic indication of what was happening there. And then they would receive patients. There would be a little, the idea with the Dakotas was to keep them on the ground for as short as possible. If they could be on for 30 minutes while they loaded up, that would be a good idea, because there were other targets, but an aircraft was an irresistible target. If as a gunner or another aircraft from the enemy you saw an aircraft, you were going to have a go at that aircraft. That was always a high-value target. So the idea is that the plane will be on the ground for a very short period of time. And this means that patients come when they can, and sometimes they have to wait for several hours until the aircraft gets there. If the weather's bad, if there are problems over the channel, and there are almost always problems over the channel, the aircraft wouldn't land when it necessarily said it was going to. Most of the air ambulance flights were made in the summer, and it was quite a hot summer in northern France and Belgium. So the injured waited, and they tried to find what little shade they could, and they waited with the nurses and orderlies who'd come from the field hospital, and sometimes they waited for hours. And they would get very cross, and then the Dakota would land and everything would be forgotten. One of the they were very clear about what level of injury could be sent for air evacuation. So if you had an abdominal injury or a chest injury, or you had a severe hemorrhage case, if you were bleeding very badly, you were not suitable for air evacuation. But as the weeks went on, hospitals got a little more liberal about who they sent. They really wanted people out of their wards. And so nurses would often land and find really quite badly injured men whose injuries they would have to really worry about when they were on the flight, along with all the other things that they were doing. So I just made a list of some of those things. Some people came on with oxygen masks, and so they had to make sure that the oxygen mask stayed on, that the oxygen tank was full up. If people had already lost a lot of blood and been given enough to travel, but really only enough, they had to keep an eye on that. They didn't carry a great deal of blood for blood transfusion, but they had to keep an eye on it. And if people had broken limbs, they had to make sure that they were sitting somewhere where their set bone was not going to be bumped into, wasn't going to be bent, wasn't going to be re-broken. They had to check dressings, because you always have to check dressings. And then they had to monitor the really complicated injuries. There was no particular problem with a head injury, although we would probably look back now and think, oh my goodness, we're sending a head injury, we should be doing that somewhere very steady. And in particular, burn injuries. For my family, burns injuries are something that we always are very aware of. My grandmother, the nurse, went on to nurse at the RAF Burns Hospital at East Grinstead. So we pay a lot of attention. I pay a lot of attention when I see the burns injury section. And also facial injuries. We'll know from the First World War that a facial injury to the jaw, to the mouth, to the eyes can be really complicated, and it has to be kept very steady so it can go straight to the surgeons for operations. And it's up to them not to treat the facial injury, but to make sure that the patient is loaded, and when they are unloaded, they are in the same state, that their injuries have not been aggravated or disrupted. And there's always tea. And the last thing that they do as they look towards the aircraft is they take the Red Cross flag down to indicate that there's no one else is to be collected, and so that the runway disappears, so it can't be seen as a potential target. And so they're doing all of those things while they're in very little space. Mostly they were bumpy flights, and they're keeping everybody calm. They've got a plane full of soldiers who are on that last leg before home. They want it to be over quickly, and they need to keep them quiet and calm. Nice handwriting, by the way. Those were the days. And so if we go back to the 13th of June, to D-Day +7, this is Lydia and her two colleagues as they return from their last flight. Here they are under, I don't know whose Dakota it was, but they've done a whole day. I think you can see on one of them that her face is quite dusty and muddy. And I think you can see that they're tired, but they've done a whole day, and they've brought back the maximum amount of patients. They flew 4 or 5 flights that first day, and there would be 1,500 evacuations made in the rest of the month, so just over nearly 3 weeks. And they got, because practice makes excellent. Perfect isn't really helpful, but practice makes excellent. They got incredibly skillful at jumping in and out of aircraft. They didn't hear the fire that was being aimed at them after a while. They got really good at knowing the space. They walked hunched down so they didn't bump their heads on any of the overall structure of the aircraft. They became very skilled in their space. We always see this. Again, if one was to see a film, and I don't think we have any film of the Nightingales, you'd see that they had a very particular movement, and you might not think about it. But if you think about a person who has really learned not to bump their head, to see everybody who's in the aircraft, to fill out a form in triplicate whilst on a bumpy aircraft, you're seeing somebody that has a set of skills that are really very impressive. So some of the key statistics for the Nightingales. On June the 16th, and this speaks to that statement, they loaded 220 patients in 40 minutes. You'd got really very good. In almost 3 days, there were a range of Dakotas. They landed every day. A new temporary runway was built. There was B5, B7, B8. They were all relatively safe. There was something like air superiority in the Neptune Beach area, and they moved 220 in 40 minutes. If you put those 220 people on the beaches, that's 220 much more complicated cases that have to be moved onto a barge, and then a barge onto a hospital ship, and then a hospital ship across the channel, choppy channel waters. They would be bumpy. Although they were bumpy on the planes, they'd be bumpy for much longer when they were on the ships. And we know there were a number of hospital ships that were sunk. So we only lost one aircraft we lost one Flying Nightingale, one aircraft with a Flying Nightingale. And what every Flying Nightingale would have told you, but sadly there aren't any left, what every Flying Nightingale would have told you is that nobody ever died on their flights. So even though the patients had more and more complex injuries, the Nightingales kept them alive. Not for very long, but it didn't feel like that when you were half an hour out over the channel and bumping your way through the clouds at 3,000 feet. No one ever died. So there were days where life got very difficult. On June the 17th, one of the Nightingales wrote that when they came in to land, their enemy had spotted them, and there was very heavy fire being directed at the aircraft, and they weren't able to land. So all those ambulances and Land Rovers full of patients didn't see the red flag going up. They had to drive away and wait to be told where else to go. Then on the 29th of June, which I think is considered to be the heaviest day of air ambulance work, they moved 690 cases in one day, and 61 of those were serious head injuries. Really difficult to do. Nobody died on a Nightingale flight. And by the end of July, when Overlord had really established a significant foothold in Northern Europe, starting to head towards Germany, they had moved 10,000 casualty cases. And again, it's important to see those cases in the aircraft, but it's also important to see that spared 10,000 cases cluttering up the D-Day beaches. Everybody knew how hard they worked, so they set a limit of 40 trips. That was an operational tour. Once you'd done your 40 trips, although the Nightingales never wanted to stop, you stopped and you went and trained. You went back to Blake Hill, one of the other RAF stations, and you trained the new generations of Nightingales that were coming. And there are Nightingales everywhere. In 1945, they send cohorts of Nightingales out to the Far East to move, to bring home prisoners of war, to move casualties around the various fronts there. And I emphasized it. In fact, I didn't just emphasize it, I emboldened it. And still, no matter where they were or what they were doing, no patient died on their watch. In fact, by November 1944, the air ambulance system of the Flying Nightingales ceases in France and Belgium. The Allies have established themselves to the extent that they don't need field hospitals anymore. So this is an image of we saw number 40 hospital, which amalgamated with 41 hospital, and into a building. They found a building and adapted it into a hospital. Nobody needed flying back to Britain for their surgery anymore. They were able to have complex surgeries and repairs done and recovery of their injuries in country. They were able to do that in military medical hospitals in France and Belgium. They would eventually be evacuated. They might be evacuated by air. They might go slowly on trains and ships, but they didn't sadly need the Nightingales anymore. Well, they didn't need the Nightingales anymore. The Nightingales operate in France and Belgium for this short period of time, from June to November 1944. But very many people are responsible for coming home quickly and well, and understanding that this was better than waiting on the beach and waiting for a barge. So these are the first three. There's Lydia and her two colleagues. They're women to be proud of. And I've written there in a more contemporary font, the proof of concept, because it's good to know the history of the Nightingales. It's a short one. We often don't understand the extraordinary technical and personal skills they brought to their role. But what they really do is they prove that aircraft are absolutely key in casualty evacuation. And so from then on, and all the wars since, we have seen aircraft and specially trained medical staff. They started to let men in, but you can't necessarily get enough women. In Korea, in Vietnam, and less so in the Falkland Islands. Nothing was done well in the Falkland Islands. But in particular, in Iraq and Afghanistan, we see an extraordinary level of expertise in this space, in the space the Nightingales understand, in that aircraft where you have to not bump your head, where everything's noisy and there's turbulence, and you may be at a certain amount of risk from enemy fire, but that is their space. They can keep people, they can bring people on board, and they can keep them alive, and they can return them to a hospital for treatment at home, and they will be in the same state that they were when they boarded. That's a really specific medical skill. And it's the Nightingales who showed us that it was possible. So I'm happy to tell you their story. I'm happy to say there were Nightingales at Arnhem when there isn't much joy to be found at Arnhem, but there was a Nightingale. So again, you would have come out of that dreadful situation and seen perhaps Lydia with her cup of tea and her steady hands and her ability to keep you alive. So this is a good day to be giving this lecture, and I'd like to thank you for coming along.